Peace and Anarchy, Episode 1.
It was my opinion that the course of the U.S. embarked on in the latter part of the 20th century would bring us a major financial crisis and engulf us in a foreign policy that would overextend us and undermine our national security.
The United States of America, right now, has the strongest, most durable economy in the world.
Too many in high places of authority became convinced that only they, armed with arbitrary government power, can bring about fairness while facilitating wealth production.
Our goal has been a growing economy that also works better for everybody.
This always proves to be a utopian dream and destroys wealth and liberty. Economic ignorance is commonplace. Keynesianism continues to thrive.
Now we've actually got to cut the cost of college. Providing 2 years of community college at no cost for every responsible student is one of the best ways to do that. Social Security and Medicare are more important than ever. If that new job doesn't pay as much, there should be a system of wage insurance.
Too many people believe government handouts are free, like printing money out of thin air and there's no cost. That deception is coming to an end. As the government continues fiddling around, our liberties and our wealth burn in the flames of a foreign policy that makes us less safe.
The United States of America is the most powerful nation on earth. Period. Period. It's not even close. It's not even close. It's not even close. We spend more on our military than the next 8 nations combined.
Why can't people understand that war always destroys wealth and liberty? Tragically, our government engages in preemptive war, otherwise known as aggression, with no complaints from the American people.
With nearly 10,000 airstrikes, we're taking out their leadership, their oil, their training camps, their weapons. We're training, arming, and supporting forces who are steadily reclaiming territory in Iraq and Syria.
The drone warfare we are pursuing worldwide is destined to end badly for us as the hatred builds, for innocent lives lost and the international laws flaunted. To develop a truly free society, the issue of initiating force must be understood and rejected. We should have more trust in ourselves, less in the government.
Our brand of democracy is hard. So my fellow Americans, whatever you may believe, whether you prefer one party or no party, whether you supported my agenda or fought as hard as you could against it, our collective futures depends on your willingness to uphold your duties as a citizen.
Why is democracy held in such high esteem when it's the enemy of the minority and makes all rights relative to the dictates of the majority? Freedom, when understood, brings people together. When tried, freedom is popular. The best chance for achieving peace and prosperity for the maximum number of people worldwide is to pursue the cause of liberty. If you find this to be a worthwhile message, spread it throughout the land.
Welcome, everyone. This is Episode 1 of Peace and Anarchy. Happy to have you. We're going to get started today with where myself, Ryan Griggs, and your co-host,
Tabor Paranti,
come from intellectually and what our own personal history is. That way you sort of have an idea of where we're going and how we're going to get there. So that's how we'll start. Tabor will talk some about her background. I'll talk some about mine. We'll talk about the name of the show, and then we'll finally get into a little substance, some content that we hope you find interesting. So Tabor, you want to talk about how you got started in the liberty movement?
All right, so I've been a libertarian for I don't know how many years at this point. Growing up, I grew up in the token Republican family in Northern California.
We all have those relatives.
And during the gubernatorial recall election of Gray Davis, I remember sitting down with my mother and we were both talking about how the Republicans never did what they were saying they were supposed to. Mm-hmm. So they'd always talk about, taxes should be cut, and they'd never cut them. And so we got the government-approved description of what all the political parties are in the mail, and we read it out, and we decided, sounds like we're libertarians. Sounds like they know what they're talking about.
They actually had libertarian on the flyer.
They have to have a description of every single political party that's on the ballot in that state. And so since the Libertarian Party is on the ballot in California, they had a short descriptor of it.
Okay.
So I've been identifying as a libertarian since then. But of course, at that point, I didn't know anyone else in the entire world who was a libertarian. I was already the only conservative-ish person at school. And, you know, add this on top of it, you know, there goes Tabor again, the weirdo. So I didn't know there was anyone else out there that thought the way I did in this sort of logical deduction manner until Ron Paul ran for president.
Which time was that you're talking about?
And so that was 2008.
Uh-huh.
And then I was like, oh my God, other people get it. There are other people out there that see this logical connection between all of these different economic events. And he kept mentioning this thing called the Mises Institute, and I finally checked it out, and it was, you know, a perfect place for me.
Yeah, the Mises Institute is a big part of the show and where we come from.
Absolutely, because we've both been to Mises University, and that's been a huge part of both of our intellectual developments.
In fact, you've been a number of times.
Yes, I've been 3 times.
Many more. I've only been once, but at 3, I think you may be setting a Mises record. Who knows?
I happen to know I don't have the record. Mark Thornton has the record. He's been to every single one.
Oh, okay. I guess that'll beat you out. What years did you go?
I went in 2011, 2012, and 2013.
In fact, we met at the last one, right? Mises 2013.
Correct.
Oh.
So each time was incredibly different. So the first time I was at Mises University, I just graduated from college, and in fact, it was Tom DiLorenzo who wrote my letter of recommendation to go to Mises University. And
cool.
I just was absorbing everything as if I was there for the first time. And then the second time that I was there, that's when I passed the Mühlich Prüfung,
And for people who don't speak German, you'd call that...
the oral examination.
Right. So that's at the end of the week. There's a written test, and then there's an oral examination.
Right.
And you passed both.
That's correct. The written test, I would say, is much more difficult than the oral test. I can talk about Austrian economics until everyone else is blue in the face. But that written test, the way the multiple choice questions are written, it's not ideal from an engineer's perspective. So that's kind of what I'm not fond of that
Right.
test. And then in 2013, the reason why I wanted to go back that year was because I heard Judge Napolitano was teaching a constitutional law class.
Uh-huh.
And I absolutely had to go to that.
So Judge Napolitano, being a Fox Business, formerly of Fox Business, still does some legal work for them, right?
Oh, he's still with Fox News. He's their chief legal analyst.
Yeah, so he does a seminar now during Mises University, and it's on constitutional law. So you were able to take that?
Right. So when I was a student at Johns Hopkins, I took a year of constitutional law, and it was not what I was expecting it to be. It wasn't about what does the Constitution say. It was about what does the Supreme Court say that the Constitution says.
Right.
So the actual text of the Constitution is meaningless in that class. And it was really just infuriating reading all those cases where, like Wickard v. Filburn, that I think most of our audience will probably be aware of, where you can't grow wheat on your own land for your own consumption because it affects the interstate commerce.
We'll be sure to link to that in the show notes.
In the trade of wheat. You're just reading about these cases, and the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution there is so totally and utterly backwards, and there's no recourse for it. So I actually remember my term paper in that class was on the constitutionality of legal tender, and the professor at the top of my final paper wrote, "I can see no logical errors here, so I have to give you an A, but I disagree with you." Which kind of sums up that class in a nutshell.
Yeah,
So
sums up a lot of mainstream view of law, right?
Absolutely.
So of course you probably got something very different with Napolitano.
Absolutely. So in Judge Napolitano's class, it's much more Socratic method, and we had to read the cases, and we had to know the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So it was what I wish the constitutional law class had been.
Yeah. And then so we met there in 2013, and we sort of stayed in contact over Facebook and social media for the next, couple of years. And just late last year, we reconnected during a celebration of Mises' birthday in San Jose, right? And
right. Well, I was living in New England for a number of years, and you were still here in California, and I just recently moved back, so that's how we ended up bumping into each other.
Yeah, totally random. We hadn't planned it at all. And we got started talking about liberty, how we got into it, and what our ideas were going forward. I mentioned the idea of wanting to start a podcast, and you had thought the same thing.
Right, and before we get into that, how did you come into libertarianism?
Good
I've
place.
actually never heard this story, so...
Good place to stop, and we'll pick up there in a second. Yeah, so my story is a little different. I guess all of us have a sort of a different coming of age story as far as libertarianism is concerned. But like you, I felt totally alone. We can flash back to my freshman year of college. I was at New York University. This would be I'm dating myself, but that's okay, the 2010-2011 school year. And I saw Ron Paul on CNN, Fox News, this sort of thing. Eventually went to YouTube. And if you haven't done this yet in our audience, I recommend doing it. Go on YouTube and search for the Giuliani moment.
Oh, that's such a great moment.
Yeah, it's really what...
It's a great clip.
It's really what hooked me. And so for those who don't know, it's a video of the Republican presidential debates during the 2008 cycle. And Ron Paul lays out the non-interventionist foreign policy, which we can get into more later on, in front of a crowd who really didn't want to hear it. And he was booed, but he continued on, and he refused to apologize.
And Giuliani was not having any of it.
He was furious, yeah. Yeah, typical New York politician. Anyway, I was inspired, to say the least, by his honesty and his sort of genuine character. So I looked him up more online. I came across a website that I'd highly recommend. If you're not familiar with it, I'd check it out. It's called Lew Rockwell, L-E-W, and then Rockwell, just like it sounds.com. Through Lew Rockwell, I found the Mises Institute, and I found the writings of an economist who we'll refer to probably over and over again by the name of...
Let me guess.
By the name,
is it Rothbard?
By the name of Murray Rothbard, yes. So after discovering his work and reading in particular a book entitled America's Great Depression, I was hooked on Austrian economics.
So I'm curious, do you have an exact instant that you remember when you went from, say, a minimal state person to an anarchist? Because I know for me, I remember the exact second that happened, and I get the feeling that a lot of other anarchists have a very similar story to that light bulb moment when it's, I can't defend the state anymore.
Yeah, actually, and it's interesting. My moment came in reading Ayn Rand.
Interesting.
And a lot of people...
Because she was not an anarchist.
Right. A lot of people will say, oh, Rand was a minarchist, and in much of her spoken record, she is. She does put forth that the state needs to be there for the provision of courts and police and national security. However, in her writing, particularly Atlas Shrugged, there's no sense of that. And prior to reading Rand, I was never really aware of either her audio recordings or anything else like that. I just read Atlas Shrugged after it had been recommended to me. And 3/4 of the way through, any last bit of me that was standing up for anything other than individualism was gone. And from there, it was an easy slide. I mean, I didn't encounter much minarchist many minarchist obstacles en route to anarchism. It was find Rand, and then Rockwell, and then Rothbard, and by then it's over.
The 3 R's of libertarianism.
Right. And so this was occurring during my first couple of years of college. After my second year in school, I decided to withdraw. At the time, I was attending a university called Elon University in North Carolina. I was majoring in business, wasn't very happy, motivated, or fulfilled by the course of study I was undertaking. So I withdrew, and it's partly for financial reasons as well. But I withdrew for a year, and I did a couple internships. The first one was at the Charles Koch Foundation. I was working with their higher education team, analyzing grants. And then I went right from Arlington, Virginia, where the Koch Foundation is, to the Mises Institute. It was January 2014, and I had emailed Pat Barnett, on a whim, really, to inquire about going to the Institute for an internship. Later on, I had heard back from her, and we set a date in early May. And once my Coke internship ended, I think it was a Friday, maybe May 3rd, over the weekend, on Monday, I was in Auburn, Alabama. And during that time, I moved Murray Rothbard's private book collection to an accessible space for people. That was a big honor. I worked with Dan Sanchez on the Online Academy. That was huge. Of course, got to do the Mises University program.
I remember when Floyd Lilly introduced you to me, and she mentioned that you were the one who moved all the books.
Yeah, that was sort of my calling card at that time. I love Floyd, by the way. She's so great. But yeah, so I passed the written exam. I passed the oral examination with honors. In fact, one of our podcasting inspirations, you might say, Tom Woods at tomwoods.com, was one of my examiners.
Oh, same here.
Oh, okay. And I also had,
you know you're doing well when Tom Woods is sitting in the background
nodding his head, right. And then to pass with honors, that's cool. So definitely a high moment for me. And then, so since then, I've gone back to school. I'm now an economics major in the graduate program for their master's degree at Cal State East Bay up here in Northern California. And we'll finish that in June. So maybe going back to when we reunited late last year,
Yep.
At an event celebrating Ludwig von Mises's birthday.
Yeah, it was about a week after I had just moved back to the Bay Area. So I grew up in Sunnyvale, California, and then I ended up going to college at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And then after college, I moved up to New England, and I was there for a few years, around 3.5-ish years. And then I decided I got a little tired of the winter, and the Bay Area was having what I like to call a hardware renaissance, where mechanical engineers were starting to get wanted again. Mm-hmm. So I really wanted to move back home, we'll say. And so that's how I ended up moving back here. And one of my friends back east, Andrew Crucione, had mentioned that there was this Mises event, and the timing just worked out perfectly. I think I drove to the event still with half my luggage in my car.
That's very random. But in any case, we ended up at the same table and got started talking about this podcast. And one of our difficulties, if this were all to come to fruition, was a name. We were stuck on the damn name.
I don't know how many emails we passed back and forth with ideas.
Far too many. Far too many. But that's okay, because you ended up attending an event in Phoenix, Arizona, hosted by the Mises Institute. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah, so I ended up going to the Mises Circle in Phoenix, and great event, by the way. And Lou Rockwell was there, and after the event, I started talking to him and telling him about our idea for the podcast, and I mentioned that we were having some serious trouble with this name. Like, I think I came up with a list of about 20 different things, and I know personally I was going way down into the academic rabbit hole with mixing together Latin and Greek words, and
yeah, it was getting bad. It was getting pretty ugly.
No doubt. And so I was describing all of this to Lou, culminating with what was probably the best of my Latin name ideas, but by no means was it good. So it was Pax Anarchia.
Oh my.
And
see what could have been, folks?
Yeah, really. And so after I mentioned this to Lou, he mentioned that, well, why not just go with peace and anarchy? And after that, it was just set. It was...
Why not indeed, huh?
Of course. Why didn't I think of that?
Exactly. Well, when Lou Rockwell recommends something to you, I mean, you gotta, you take it with this, serious consideration. So, and so once we had the name, we were pretty much off and running.
Right. I registered the domain name, I think, 2 days after that.
Right. But it should be pointed out, it's not as if he said it, so therefore we picked it up. The show, where we come from, the ideas we're going to be talking about, do revolve centrally around notions of what peace means and what anarchy means. Maybe you can tell us what, in your opinion, how you conceive of peace and anarchy. Why is that the name of our podcast?
So for me, going back to that Latin monstrosity that I came up with, so I was inspired by the term Pax Romana, which was the time of peace worldwide when the Romans were in charge. And then when you extend that forward, there are also terms Pax Britannica and Pax Americana.
I see.
And so my idea was, well, there should be an age of peace from anarchy. And of course, when you think about the term anarchy, we always have to note this. Anarchy does not mean chaos.
Right.
Anarchy means an absence of rulers.
Right.
And without rulers, it doesn't mean that, everyone goes out in the street and starts shooting people. Like, I know personally, if the government ceased to exist tomorrow, that doesn't mean I'm going to go out and shoot my neighbors.
Right.
I kind of want them to still be around. And I think, by and large, that describes 99.99% of society.
Mm-hmm.
And the 0.01% that it doesn't describe, they don't care if the government is there or not.
Sure.
And Bob Higgs touches on this perfectly. Anarchy is not utopia.
Right.
But it ensures that you don't have something guaranteeing violence.
Mm-hmm. And I've had people tell me prior to the launch of the show that, peace and anarchy is sort of redundant. Well, sure, to somebody who's been studying these issues for a long time.
People in the movement.
Yeah, it's obvious. Sure, peace is akin, the other side of the same coin as anarchy. But that's not immediately clear, and I think it's important for us to really flesh that out.
Well, not to mention, I think in a lot of ways that they describe different aspects of what society is. So the peace really goes along with foreign policy in many ways.
Right.
And anarchy describes the market.
Mm-hmm. And really, it's difficult to have one without the other, right?
Absolutely. If there's a government present, this
is a negation.
War is the health of the state, right?
Yes.
There's no such thing as a peaceful government.
Exactly. And we'll get more into the nature of the state, the nature of government in further episodes. One thing I think is important to reiterate here or draw emphasis to is that despite our admiration and inspiration from the Mises Institute, we're not echo chambers, right? This is going to be quite different. I know that's one thing that's important to you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously not everyone at the Mises Institute agrees with everything the other person says, right? There's a wide variety of opinions of the people that are associated with the Mises Institute, and I think this fits along right with that.
Right. In fact, one of the talks that was given at the Mises Circle event you attended was by Lew Rockwell, and it was on immigration.
Yeah, and I think that's probably our biggest disagreement with Lew, probably. And so, to summarize Lew's position on immigration, he is, along with Hoppe, a closed borders advocate.
Right. And before you go on, Hoppe, who is that?
So Hans Hermann Hoppe is another preeminent Austrian economic scholar. He has written many fabulous books, particularly Economic Science and the Austrian Method.
One of my favorites.
As well as Democracy, the God That Failed. And for me personally, Democracy, the God That Failed is one of my favorite Austrian books. That, along with Walter Block's Defending the Undefendable, were what converted me to straight anarchism, as opposed to some sort of, well, I think anarchy is the goal, but we should, use the electoral means to get there. Yeah.
Okay.
Throw that all aside.
So Hans Hoppe, you might consider him a very strict anarcho-capitalist, right? So
correct.
Sort of
and actually, the first time I was at Mises University, he was there. He was the opening lecturer, and he was there throughout the entire week, dispensing his knowledge to the rest of us.
So to place him in context for people who maybe don't know, Hoppe would say himself that he was really one of Rothbard's closest students. In fact, he went from, I'm not sure where he was, but when Rothbard acquired his position at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas.
So Hoppe was in Germany,
right.
And he held, I believe he held Mises's old position.
Nonetheless, when Rothbard moved to Nevada, Hoppe applied for a position there as well and got it, and the two went and were there for, I think, 9 or 10 years. So Hoppe is really a very close line from Rothbard himself. Anyway, so you're saying that Lou, in terms of immigration in the modern debate, is sort of siding with Hans Hoppe.
Correct. In terms of immigration, and they advocate a closed borders, meaning the state should enforce the political border. I'm trying to be as neutral here as possible. The state should enforce the border between two separate countries because in the less than ideal circumstances that we currently are in, the state is the only way that we can protect that so-called property barrier.
Right. So there's a lot of terms that we really have to be very careful about, and I think this might be something that maybe Lou has looked over. Maybe some other people who identify as libertarians might be looking over this as well. But a closed border position, or any sort of position that advocates for selective entry into the country, and any version of that, really focuses on the enforcement of political or state borders, right? We're not saying
this
that...
is not a private property border. This is an arbitrary state border.
Exactly.
And both Lou and Hoppe recognize this, I believe.
Sure. They sort of see it as a halfway meeting point. So given that the state exists, that we don't live in a perfect non-state society, the state should act, at least this is how their argument goes, as a steward of the private property, which requires a remarkable change of nature on behalf of the state, but we'll set that aside for now. They think that the state should act as a steward of private property. That is to say, they should act in the best interests of the individuals who actually do own or would own, under a private system, the property in question. So that is the property that is at the bottom of California and Arizona and Texas. That the state should act as a steward of the true owners.
Well, I noticed we're not worried about that border up in Canada.
Yeah, interestingly, right?
Yeah. So Lou's argument really centered around the fact that he believed that taxpayers owned shares of this land. So Lou was saying it is inappropriate for us to assume that the land I use owned very loosely because the government can't really own anything,
Right.
that the land controlled by the government cannot be deemed as either owned or unowned, right? Because it's clearly not in control by private citizens.
It's stolen goods.
It's stolen goods. And it's also, according to him, you can't say it's unowned because the government uses ours, the private people that it exploits, our resources, in order to maintain control of that land.
Right.
So he has this sort of share system, I believe, where all of us taxpayers have shares in this land, and the only entity at this point that can really coordinate everything is the government, which it takes some serious mental jumping jacks to get to, in my mind.
I agree.
Because if a thief came to you, said, give me all your money, and then ran off and bought jewels with it, you would be entitled back to the money itself, not to the jewels.
Right.
So really, in this case, the taxpayers aren't entitled to the land, and honestly, I can't claim any ownership over land in Arizona that I've never set foot on.
Yeah. And
I'd rather have my tax money back than have them protect this border that is really only a problem because the state exists in the first place.
Yeah. And another point that the Rockwell-Hoppe position, we can call it, revolves around is the consumption of welfare services. So I think we'd all agree that welfare...
Well, they all agree that it's a side point. It is separate from the immigration issue.
In our view, yes. But I think that the Rockwell-Hoppe argument would maintain that because welfare consumption is likely to increase with an increase in immigrants, that this would then lead to, further down the line, further expropriation and exploitation of the taxpayer in order to fund this extended provision of welfare services.
I think this is where Lou and Hoppe disagree, perhaps. I've heard Lou say similar things where the culture that's brought over is very anti-liberty and intends to change the mindset of the people that are at the place that they're immigrating to. But I know in several of Hoppe's articles, he flat out says that the welfare issue is in fact separate, as well as the idea that immigrants are stealing our jobs. The free trade argument is completely separate, and the idea that an immigrant is coming over here to steal your job, when in fact you're competing in several different markets, is rather absurd, and everyone agrees on that.
Yeah.
But what strikes me about that cultural issue is how similar it is to the leftists' arguments against gentrification. It's pretty much the exact same thing, but on a different scale. So that's one of the major issues that we get here in the San Francisco Bay Area, is the idea that the gentrifiers, the people moving into traditionally ethnic neighborhoods, are stealing the resources from the poorer people that currently live there. And it's a very similar argument, just on a different scale, because in gentrification it's a city, but in this immigration debate it's the state or the country. But it's the same idea that you have someone coming over and stealing the resources of someone else.
Yeah, I wrote a piece on this actually prior to, or was it prior? Just around when Lou spoke at the Mises event. Yeah, this is by the time he had already had his article up. And my big contention was that, one, you need to recognize that there's a difference between political and private borders, and that just as so-called public property or state property is illegitimate or oxymoronic, so too are state or public borders, right? If the nature of that which the state claims is illegitimate, so too are the borders that circumscribe it, right?
Absolutely.
So the following libertarian position, in my opinion, should be that, well, get rid of this notion of state property, return the property back to private owners, and then the true owners themselves can decide whether they prefer immigration or not. One thing that Lou does say is that the state, in acting as a steward of private property owners or true owners, well, the true owners don't want immigration, all of them. Therefore, the state, acting on their behalf, should exclude immigrants. But it's not always the case.
Who are those true owners at this point? Do we even know?
Right. There's a difficulty there. But supposing that the true owners themselves, I mean, perhaps they don't all want to exclude immigrants. There are economic benefits to lower cost labor.
Absolutely.
And so what's to say that
California's a great example of that.
Yeah. What's to say that a true owner, say along the Mexican border, wouldn't open his doors to immigrants wanting to come in and work? So there's a big problem when you say the state acting as steward of true owners in their or on their behalf excludes other people. Well, we don't know that the true owners wish to exclude everyone.
Right. That's assuming a collective want.
Yeah. In fact, I write it's a typical one-size-fits-all government approach. There's a perceived problem, deal with it with the government edict, and the consequences that arise down the way, we'll deal with it then. So I think the libertarian position here is not open borders or closed borders. It's anti-political border. Right? If we get rid of the political borders, reestablish true private ones, then individual true owners can act on their own preferences.
Right, and I don't think that the problem is necessarily that establishment. I think the question is really, how do you implement that? How do you get rid of those political borders? Because, like I mentioned, who are the true owners?
Yeah.
That goes back to the idea of retribution. How do we trace things back?
Right.
It wasn't even homesteaded in the first place. I think something like 89% of the state of Nevada is federally owned.
It's federally.
I mean, technically it doesn't even qualify to be a state. If Abraham Lincoln hadn't admitted it to the Union, it doesn't have enough private ownership to qualify.
Yeah, the notion of retribution and tracing back property titles to where they rightly should be is a certainly an empirical matter that's very difficult to hash out. We can get into retribution theory maybe on another episode. I do want to mention one other thing that Ron Paul said. Of course, Ron Paul is a central figure. We can't overvalue his name and what he brings to the table in terms of politics and economics, but also in terms of our show. Enough, right? He is a very, like Rockwell, like Mises, like Rothbard,
well, I think
a central
for
person.
both of us,
right?
Discovering Ron Paul is what led us to the more academic pursuits of Austrian economics in general.
Sure, and you heard us both in our own stories. Hearing Ron Paul, seeing Ron Paul was a turning point, an inflection point for both of us. And let's not forget what he said in, I think it was his 2012 campaign, regarding the construction of a fence.
Oh yes, the wall
along the southern border. And he pointed out, again, sort of like the Giuliani moment, against much disapproval, that fences and walls built by the state ostensibly might be used to keep people out, but in the end always are used to keep people in.
That's right. How many people wanted to escape to East Germany?
Exactly. So, obviously, if we were to follow the Rockwell-Hoppe argument, some procedures, some new edicts or laws, some physical capital, all of these things would have to be employed in the geographic location we're talking about in order to, quote-unquote, keep them out, or keep out the ones we don't want, right? Which sounds fine and nice for the short term, but like Ron Paul says, these state procedures and state policies and walls and people, probably, are prime and ready to be turned around the opposite way when things don't go well in a given country.
And that's a very important point to make, because it goes back to other political aspects where, remember the czar system, when that became really huge, when Obama started appointing all these people to be like, oh, this is the technology czar and this is the gas prices
right.
czar and
Just
all of that.
Name a state captain. That'll take care of the problem.
Right. And so I remember talking to Gary Johnson about this, and he also missed this point where you need to get rid of the government system altogether. You can't just appropriate its resources for your purposes. So his response to, would you abolish the czar system, was, no, they'd be all right because they'd be my czars. Mm-hmm. And pretending that, okay, fine, your guys are okay, what about the guy after you? What was the term Edward Snowden used? Turnkey tyranny. That was it, turnkey tyranny. So, okay, well, the one guy that constructed the wall might be okay, the guy after it might not be, and who knows who else the electorate will pick, because clearly the electorate, it's not libertarians.
Mm-hmm. And this is a sort of a theme that you get in the work of Robert Higgs, Higgs, for anybody who hasn't read his work before.
Another one of our favorite professors.
Another big time guy for sure. He's already liked our Facebook page, by the way, which really, that means if you haven't liked our Facebook page and Bob Higgs has, you're behind the times here. So, let's get with it,
Plus, I get
folks.
to claim him as an alumni. So both Bob Higgs and I went to Johns Hopkins University. So.
Yeah. But this is a big part of his work with the ratchet effect, that once these institutions, these policies, these procedures, the physical capital, once it's there, once the state has created this schematic of how to carry out some alleged policy or some preference that the public ostensibly has, it just so happens that those procedures and policies, they may be rolled back in the future to some extent, but they're never eliminated.
Right, it never goes back to the starting point.
They never disappear. That once the precedent for a new state intervention in your life exists, it's not going away.
Right, let's look at the IRS, for example. The ideas that are currently going around the Republican Party are not to abolish the IRS, really. They say it, but they're really talking about, we'll get rid of the IRS because it has a really bad stigma, but we'll put in a different tax collection agency.
Repeal and replace is the biggest con of the political lexicon.
Right, we'll repeal the income tax, but we'll replace it with the fair tax, as if any tax could be fair.
Right. Another point here I have regarding immigration in Rockwell and Hoppe, I have here what is commonly referred to as the closed border policy is really a policy of aggression and reassertion of state control over stolen property. This is something I don't think Rockwell and Hoppe are fully, or maybe I should say Rockwell more in particular, aren't fully thinking of. Similar to the ratchet effect argument we just made, for the state to enforce political borders and to advocate that the state enforce political borders is really the same as advocating that the state reassert its illegitimate control, its use of force over a given resource, over some land. Which for a libertarian is highly problematic. We don't want to be engaged in taking a position that involves the state then reasserting its illegitimate authority, right?
No, and I think the reason why it's brought up is because of that protection against the cultural issues. And so really what has to happen is a complete separation of these truly distinct topics. You have welfare, you have immigration, you have free trade, and they can all be distinctly dealt with by dismantling the state in different ways. You can't embellish the state in immigration to protect against the problems of welfare.
So if you haven't got the point by now, folks, this is an anti-state podcast. Our byline is Peace and Anarchy, crushing statism every Sunday. And we mean it. So we hope that in this latter part of the show, you got a little flair of the fact that we aren't echo chambers for the Mises Institute, but at the same time, we hope that you've sort of have an appreciation of where we come from ideologically and intellectually. People like Lew Rockwell, Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, Bob Higgs, Judge Andrew Napolitano, of course Ron Paul, which we've said over and over again. These are the sort of people, and more importantly, their ideas are the sort of ideas that we are going to weave throughout our podcast every Sunday right here at peaceanarchy.com. Tabor, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
So I'd like to point out that if you haven't followed us on Facebook or Twitter, to please click like and please click follow.
Right, we're facebook.com/Peace Anarchy Podcast. We're on Twitter at Voice of Rothbard. If you can believe that wasn't taken, it wasn't. But we are on Twitter at Voice of Rothbard. We'll be up and running at liberty.me shortly. Stay tuned to the website. You'll see some information about that.
As always, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or any number of various other places that accept RSS feeds.
There you go. And of course, we do want to hear your feedback. Get at us on Facebook, Twitter, email, whatever.
Or even on the website. We have a lovely little suggestion box typed up just for your suggestions.
All right, folks. That's been Peace and Anarchy, Episode 1. Bye for now.